Welcome back to Moonrest. I'm your host, William. If your mind is still holding onto the day, let it rest here for a while. Settle in, let your body grow heavy, and let your eyes close whenever they're ready. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Let's begin. The Weaver of Aurora Threads. There was once a cottage at the edge of a very old forest, in a country so far north that winter did not so much arrive as simply refuse to leave. The cottage had a crooked chimney, a green door faded soft by snow, and two small windows that glowed amber every evening, like a pair of watchful, sleepy eyes. Inside that cottage lived a young weaver named Ilara. She was not lonely, not in any way that needed fixing. She had simply, over the years, made peace with quiet, the way some people make peace with rain, or with the sound of their own breathing at night. Ilara's days moved in a gentle, repeating shape, the way a river moves the same way past the same stones each morning. She woke before the sun, when the sky was still the deep blue black of the last hour of night. She would slip out from beneath her quilt, feel the cold cedar floor beneath her feet, and cross the room to coax the fire back to life. A few dry pine needles, a curl of birch bark, a patient breath. While the fire warmed, she would set the kettle on its hook and measure out dried herbs for tea. Something with a little mint in it. Something that tasted like the forest just before snowfall. Then, always, she opened the curtains. Not to let in the daylight. There wasn't any yet, but to look at the sky, to see whether it was simply dark or whether it was waiting for something. She would gather her materials, small jars of pale wool, spindles worn smooth by years of hands, a comb carved from antler, a shuttle so old its edges had gone soft and round. She would sit at her loom by the window, and she would weave, sometimes plain wool blankets for villagers 3 valleys over. Warm and ordinary and good. But some blankets were not ordinary at all. Because Ilara possessed a gift that she had never spoken of to anyone. Because there had never been anyone nearby to speak to. And because some gifts simply don't need telling. They only need doing. Ilara could hear the aurora. Not as words. Not as any language a person could write down. She heard it the way you might hear a sound in a dream. A sound that is somehow both very far away and right beside your ear. Sometimes it sounded like small bells, struck once and then muffled by snow. Sometimes like silk drawn slowly across silk. Sometimes like a single held note on an instrument that does not exist anywhere else in the world. And when she heard it, when the sky above the pines began, ever so faintly to sing, she knew a certain kind of night was coming. A night when the lights would come down close enough to touch. The aurora, Alara had learned long ago, could not simply be taken. It had to be invited, the way you might invite a shy animal to eat from your open palm. Patient, unhurried, careful not to reach. On the nights when she heard the sky begin to hum, she would dress warmly. Wool socks, a shawl the color of oat milk, mittens with the fingertips worn thin from handling delicate things, and she would carry her old silver spindle out to the small clearing behind the cottage. She would set the spindle upright in the snow, and she would wait. The aurora, when it was ready, did not fall. It descended, the way a held ribbon settles slowly to the floor when you finally let it go. Thin, glowing strands would separate gently from the great curtain of light overhead and drift downward, unhurried, weightless, curling faintly in the cold air like breath on a winter morning. Alara would reach up, never grasping, only offering her hands, palms open, and the threads would settle across her fingers like something choosing to land there. She had learned over many winters that each color carried its own quiet nature. Green carried peacefulness, the kind that settles into your shoulders after a long day finally ends. Blue carried stillness, the particular silence of a house at midnight, when even the clocks seemed to be resting. Violet carried dreams, not any specific dream, but the soft, formless feeling just before one begins. Silver carried quiet memories, the kind you don't chase, that simply arrive, uninvited and welcome in like an old song on the radio. Pale gold carried warmth, not the warmth of fire, but the warmth of being expected somewhere. Soft pink carried tenderness, the feeling of being cared for without needing to ask. Alara would gather each color separately, winding them with slow turns of her wrist around the silver spindle, until the spindle itself seemed to glow faintly from within, like a lantern made of moonlight. Then, and only then, would she carry the spindle back inside, set it beside her loom, and begin. The rhythm of her work never changed, whatever the pattern. It went always the same simple way. Pull, pass, tighten, rest, pull, pass, tighten, rest. It was less like work and more like breathing. A rhythm so old and so familiar to her hands that her mind was free to wander wherever it liked while she wove. The blankets she made from these threads were unlike anything sold in any village market. They did not simply keep out the cold. They held, somehow, the feeling of the sky they came from, vast and quiet and utterly safe. People who slept beneath one said they dreamed more gently, that the nights felt shorter and kinder. Aurora had always believed her loom, and her strange gift had come down to her from the weaver before her, a woman she had never met, who had lived in this same cottage long before she arrived. She knew this only the way one knows old, comfortable facts, without needing proof, because it had simply always felt true. But one particular winter evening, the kind where the cold outside makes the warmth inside feel almost like a held secret, Aurora was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a loose floorboard back into place when she noticed it wasn't sitting flush. She pressed on it. It gave, ever so slightly. Curious, not afraid, only curious, the way you might be curious about a drawer you'd never opened. She worked her fingers beneath the edge and lifted it. Underneath, wrapped in a square of plain linen gone soft and pale with age, was a small, unfinished blanket. Its threads were unmistakably aurora threads. She would have known that glow anywhere. But dimmed now, resting, the way embers rest until someone breathes on them again. She lifted it carefully into the firelight and studied the pattern woven into it. It showed a small cottage beneath a wide northern sky. Snow at its base, smoke curling gently from its chimney. And in the pattern on the cottage's face, one single window left empty. Unwoven. Simply pale, bare thread waiting. Aurora sat with it a long while, turning it over in her lap, running her thumb along the edge where the weaving simply stopped. She did not feel frightened by it. She felt only the quiet, pleasant tug of a question with no urgency behind it. The kind of question that can sit beside you for years without ever needing to be solved today. What is this blanket waiting for, she wondered. And who was it that stopped weaving so close to the end? She wrapped it back in its linen, but she did not return it to the floor. She set it instead on the shelf beside her loom, where she could see it each morning while her tea steeped. And there it waited through the rest of that winter, patient as snow. Some weeks later, on an evening when the cold had a particular bite to it and the snow fell in slow, fat flakes, Aurora was at her loom when she heard, faintly, a sound that did not belong to the forest. Footsteps. careful ones, uncertain of their welcome. She was not alarmed. Travelers passed this way rarely, but not never. She rose, wrapped her shawl a little tighter, and opened the green door before the visitor even had the chance to knock. There, dusted in snow, stood a young traveler. Cheeks pink from the cold, breath rising in soft clouds. Eyes wide with the particular astonishment of someone who has just spent an hour following a strange green glow through the trees, half certain they were imagining it. "I saw the light," the traveler said, a little breathless. "Above the trees. I wasn't sure what I thought." Alara only smiled, the way you smile at weather you've long since made peace with. "It does that," she said. "Come in before you're any colder." Inside, the cottage did what cottages do best on a night like that. There was hot tea, dark and a little sweet. There was bread, warm enough that the butter melted the moment it touched. There were candles and the low, steady crackle of the fire, and outside, muffled by glass and snow, almost no sound at all. The traveler sat wrapped in one of Alara's plain wool blankets, hands curled around a mug, watching the room with the quiet wonder of someone trying not to stare and failing gently. Their eyes kept drifting to the loom by the window and to the low, warm hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere in the cottage at once. "What is it you weave?" the traveler asked, eventually, softly. The way you ask a question you're not sure you're allowed to ask. Alara considered this for a moment, turning her mug slowly in her hands. "Blankets," she said. "Mostly ordinary ones. And sometimes," she added, glancing toward the window, toward the faint green beginning to shimmer above the tree line. "Not ordinary at all." They did not rush the conversation after that. They let it move the way the fire moved, slow, unbothered, warm without needing to explain itself. There is a particular kind of comfort in sitting with someone new and discovering you don't need to fill every silence. That the silence itself can be a kind of company. Alara found herself, without quite deciding to, telling the traveler about the aurora, about the threads, about the small, unfinished blanket beneath the floorboards with its one empty window. The traveler listened the way good listeners do, without hurrying her toward an ending, without needing the story to mean anything more than what it was. "Would you show me?" the traveler asked at last, nodding toward the window, toward the sky, which had, in the last hour, begun very faintly to sing. Alara looked up. She could hear it now too. The small bells, the silk on silk, the single held note. Tonight was one of the nights. "Yes," she said, reaching for her shawl. "Wear something warm." They stepped out into a night that felt enormous. The forest around the cottage had gone perfectly still, the way forests do just before something quiet and important happens. Aurora led the way, lantern in hand, though they barely needed it. The snow itself seemed to hold a little light of its own, pale and blue beneath the moon. The pines stood heavy and hushed, their branches bowed under soft caps of snow, like patient old shapes waiting out the winter together. Now and then, a small weight of snow slipped free from a high branch and fell, in a slow, silent puff to the ground below. They walked without hurry, their breath rising in pale clouds ahead of them, their scarves pulled up against the cold. The traveler noticed small tracks crossing the path now and then. A fox, perhaps, or a hare, delicate stitches sewn into the white. "How far?" the traveler asked quietly, not because they were impatient, but because the stillness made ordinary talking feel almost too loud. "Not far," Aurora said, just as quietly. "The lake knows when to wait for us." They passed beneath frosted branches that arched overhead, like the ribs of some great, gentle animal sleeping. The cold smelled of pine resin and clean snow, and something else, something Aurora had never quite found the word for. The smell, perhaps, of the sky itself when it comes close enough to touch. Far off, through gaps in the trees, distant mountains stood pale and blue against the darker sky. Patient shapes that had watched 1,000 winters pass this same way. Slowly, the trees began to thin. Ahead, through the last screen of pines, a soft light was beginning to spread across the snow. Not moonlight, but something with more color in it, more movement. They stepped out from the tree line together. And there it was. A frozen lake spread out before them, wide and smooth and silver white, ringed by dark pines, and beyond them, the pale shoulders of distant mountains. And above it all, filling the entire dome of the sky, the aurora moved. Ribbons of green folded slowly into silver. Silver drifted into violet. Violet deepened gently into blue, the whole sky shifting like something breathing, unhurried, endless. Below, the frozen lake held every color perfectly. A second sky laid flat across the ice, so that for a long moment neither of them could say for certain which direction was up. They stood at the edge of the ice, small beneath all that light, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing frightening in the size of it, only a kind of wonder too large for words. The feeling of being held gently by something far bigger than yourself and not needing to understand it in order to feel safe within it. Wonder without urgency. After a while, Ilara knelt in the snow and set her silver spindle upright before her, the way she always did. The traveler knelt beside her, watching. High above, the lights began, slowly, to descend. Thin threads separated from the great curtain overhead and drifted down, unhurried, curling gently through the cold air. Green first, then a thread of pale gold, then one of soft violet. Ilara reached up, palms open, and the threads settled onto her hands as though they had simply been waiting for somewhere to land. "You can try," she said softly, without looking away from the sky. The traveler lifted their hands, uncertain, and a thread of pale silver drifted down and curled, weightless, around their fingers, cool and warm all at once, like moonlight that had somehow learned to be gentle. They both worked slowly, without speaking much, winding the glowing threads around the spindle in long, unhurried turns. The spindle began to glow softly from within, a small lantern of a gathered light. Ilara's hands knew this motion the way her lungs knew breathing. Turn, gather, rest. Turn, gather, rest. The traveler found, without quite trying to, that their own hands had slowed to match her rhythm. That some rhythms once nearby are simply easy to fall into. The cold no longer felt sharp. It felt soft, the way deep quiet always does once you've been sitting in it long enough. Their breathing slowed. The lake was silent beneath them, the sky vast and slow moving above them. And somewhere far behind, through the trees, the cottage waited with its fire still glowing in the windows. When the spindle was full, heavy now with soft light, green and gold and silver and violet all wound together, Ilara rose, and the traveler rose with her, and together, unhurried, they turned back toward the trees, toward home, while the aurora went on moving slowly overhead, patient, indifferent to time, exactly as it always had. Back at the cottage, the fire had burned low but steady, keeping its patient watch over an empty room. Ilara fed it a little more wood, and it woke gently, filling the space with a soft amber light. She set the glowing spindle beside her loom, took down the small, unfinished blanket from its shelf, and unwrapped it from its linen. The traveler settled into the chair nearby, wrapped in a plain wool blanket, watching quietly as Ilara sat at her loom and began, at last, to finish what someone else had started so long ago. Pull, pass, tighten, rest. The old rhythm returned, soft and steady, and beneath her hands, the pattern began, slowly, to complete itself. The little woven cottage, the smoke curling from its chimney, the wide northern sky threaded now in green and silver and pale gold, and the window. As Ilara worked the last threads into place, filling in that single pale waiting square, she understood, gently, without any great shock of realization. The way you understand something you'd known all along but simply hadn't looked at directly. That the cottage in the pattern was her own. That the empty window had never meant something was missing. It had only meant something was waiting. She glanced up once at the traveler sitting quietly by the fire, wrapped in warm wool, watching her hands move with the loom's old, patient rhythm. Some places wait quietly for us, she thought, before we even know we are looking for them. She did not say this aloud. She only smiled softly and kept weaving until the last thread was set. And the pattern, after who knew how many years, was finally completely whole. Ilara lifted the finished blanket from the loom. It was soft, warm. It smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke and clean winter air. She folded it once, then again, and carried it to where the traveler sat by the fire. She laid it gently over their shoulders. It was warm. It was quiet. It felt somehow like I'm being wrapped in the whole night sky. Outside, the aurora went on moving. Slowly, gently, above the trees, above the cottage, above the frozen lake, far behind them now, holding its silver light quietly beneath an empty sky. The fire burned low. Amber. Soft. Unhurried. The wind outside had gone gentle. Just a whisper now moving through the pines. snow kept falling. Slow. Quiet. Settling softly on the windowsill. The loom stood still by the window. Its work for tonight was finished. Aurora sat beside the fire. She pulled a second blanket. Plain wool. Familiar. Warm. Over her own shoulders. Her breathing slowed. The traveler's eyes had already closed. The cottage was quiet. The fire was warm. The blanket was soft. The snow kept falling. The aurora moved slowly above the roof. Somewhere above the trees, green folded into silver, silver into violet, violet into a deep, soft, endless blue. The cottage was warm. The night was still. And the whole world, for now, was simply this: a fire, a soft light in the sky, and a blanket woven from starlight, settling gently over tired shoulders. That's all for tonight. If you'd like another quiet night like this, you can return to Moonrest anytime. Moonrest is right where you left it. Sleep well, sleepy one.